Hey HTDA, and welcome back to this step-by-step guide to Dyson Sphere Program. This series is intended for players that are relatively new to the game or are simply overwhelmed by the complexity. And today we are going to solve all our science problems in one go, because we have our mall set up now, and we are probably going to face some issues with science now, because as you can see, this is not going particularly fast and it's only the yellow science. So let's go fix all of that in one go. Now you can make this build wherever you want, but I recommend doing it somewhere else than your mall planet. And well, why not use our home planet for that exact purpose? I like having a planet dedicated to a mall and a planet dedicated to science, and that is exactly what we're going to be doing. So let's find a good spot. Now, the downside of our home planet, as I've mentioned before, is that you have a lot of oceans getting in the way. But I think we have a pretty decent building space over here. It's pretty much on the opposite side. It's a little bit to the east, I guess, from where we came from with our original base. But if you want to be building along with me, I'll briefly show you where we are on the planet. So, yeah, you hopefully should be able to find this area if you turn your own facing to the north. However, we will be paving most of this because we need plenty of space. Now, just as a side note, when you're filling in large areas like this, you might find yourself out of soil pile, but it's an easy thing to get if you look for these type of hills. So if you pave over these, even if you don't use the actual foundations that show on the floor, you will get a huge amount of soil pile. Now, it's a little inconvenient to have to chase those hills down, and there's certain types of planets that have a lot of these hills and giant hills that give you tons and tons of this stuff, but in the early game you don't need to pave out that much stuff just yet, and this should go a very long way, at least in making you able to make your first larger builds. Now, as always with my larger builds, I'm going to start building on the inside of the large area of the area around the equator. This is the largest building area that you have, and if you start building your blueprints from the edge of this line, typically you will be able to place them anywhere within the equator area, so that just makes it very flexible later on. We are going to make a build that is going to produce 2 of each type of science from the get-go. And I mean 2 of each type of science except for the white science, which requires an actual Dyson sphere, which you don't have yet. But at least it will allow us to clear out pretty much the entire technology tree. Now, I really like building my builds from raw resource all the way to the end products, and I also like to make sure it's to ratio. Perfect ratios just ensure you're not over or under producing anything, and it just makes sure you don't have any weird bottlenecks. And the nice thing about the logistic bots is that that makes things a lot easier to keep my builds clean, efficient, and just good looking, and of course that's a bonus as well. And it's actually a kind of a hybrid between the modular build and a perfect ratio build, how I would normally do it, because we are going to use all those logistic bots. Now, I'm going to lay this out section by section. So over here you see the section that has all the base materials being produced from raw resources, and that includes copper. There's 11 of these smelters over here. We have 22 for the silicon. We have a total of 30 for the graphite. We have a total of 14 for titanium, and we have 3 for glass, only 7 for magnets, and a total of this is 12 for iron. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but this is actually enough to make all the types of signs that we're going to need, all the 5 colors, with a rate of 2 per second, assuming we proliferate everything with Mark II proliferation. And that's usually where these builds get very clunky, because you need some way to get those spray coders in. And well, as before, I will just use them all in a single line and kind of build it out section by section, and that will allow us to keep everything very, very clean. Oh, and another side note, you might have noticed that my build is kind of bare bones. There's no power, there's no sorters, and that is because I'm actually making this build on the fly, and I'm not entirely sure everything is going to stay where it is. Now, it most likely will be, because this is a very straightforward way of building, but I just add in sorters and powers all the way at the end, just so I can ensure only having to do that once and not having to restructure something and then having to do all that power and sorter layouts over and over again. For the second tier, I'm going with a similar layout, but I again need to leave room for the proliferation. So I need to make sure I space everything out. So putting everything in this tiny little hole over here is not going to fit. So I'll need to clean up these belts a little bit. So basically what I'm doing is I am trying to align these distributors or these storage units for now with the storage units that stick the furthest out in this build. Or this part of the build, and then just to make sure it looks very clean once we start filling this up with the second tier level of items. I'm actually considering keeping the smelters with the smelters and the assemblers with the assemblers, because smelters are more compact, as you can see, than the assemblers are, so it's a little bit annoying if you want to space them out in such a way that they align nicely with one-to-one with the others. So you need to leave a lot of room, which just looks a little bit weird, I think. So yeah, let's see. So we need 2 assemblers making gears, we need 4 of them making circuit boards, and we need 3 of them making magnetic coils. Expanding on this idea a little bit further, I'm trying to keep all the resources as efficient as I can keep them. So in this case, I'm adding the silicon to a belt that already has the copper on it, so I can also make the components. And this is a pretty long stretch, actually. We need a total of 11 of these to have enough. And the reason we need so many is because we also need a lot of processors, so we have a total of 11 assemblers making processors as well. And now the nice thing about this layout is that normally in a perfect ratio build that I want to keep compact, I would have to loop belts back on themselves or somehow fill in the proliferators, and now I don't have to do that anymore. I can just bring those with the logistic bots back to over here and then feed them back onto a belt. And normally that wouldn't work as well, because of if you try to do the same with planetary logistics, then those things are just too big to neatly fit into your build. So far, I'm really liking this new type of build. Now let's see how this keeps up, because as you can see, we are getting some gaps. So let's see if we can actually make the most out of those. Okay, so I actually think this is a pretty elegant way to filling in those gaps. Now, this looks a lot more complicated than it is, so let me show you what I'm doing. I'm making the magnetic coils over here like I was before. So there's this box over here that's going to put magnets on this belt that's now hiding underneath here. And we are also going to be putting those magnets in this box as always. Now we want to proliferate them, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to transport them back to this box, then put them on this belt. Then there's going to be a sprayer on top of this top belt over here. And then this belt is actually going to run over the unproliferated magnet coils belt and then back down. And then over here we can make some engines from the proliferated iron that we have on this belt. We can also bring in the proliferated gears on this belt, and we have the proliferated magnetic coils over here. Now the gears are coming from another box over here, which is just going to be transporting the gears from here back to here in order for it to be proliferated on this same line once again, and then be put into the engines. Now these engines are once again going to be put in this box, transported all the way back here, being put on this belt, and then it goes all the way over here. I should probably mark that up so I don't forget. There we go. And then those engines are going to go back into the turbines. Now, of course, this does add a little bit of lasagna, or whatever you want to call this. It's not really spaghetti, and I do think it's really straight and organized. Normally I like to keep all my belts flat on the ground, but this is actually a lot more space efficient doing it like this. And yeah, I kind of like it. So we're going with this. Now we're far from done, so we need to keep up the speed in order to make this episode not last for 5 hours. We need a lot of liquids or liquid-based stuff as well. So I have a total of 11 of these plastics chemical facilities and 4 acid ones. And the nice thing about these is that you can share a lot of the resources in between them. So I actually have 4 belts in between, and that should supply both these plastic as well as the acid. Now we need quite a few more liquids, so let's add in a few more. Oh, and by the way, I'm making sure I leave some space in between here because I know we need more of these smelters as well, but I can always just copy and paste this and move this a little bit up or down depending on where we need to go. Adding in the graphene, I just realized that we don't necessarily need to have the belts always going from left to right. We can always just loop back on ourselves. So in this case, I'm doing that with the graphite. So the graphite is already being used here with the plastic, but we also need some graphite to make graphene. So we're just using the same belt, and this is going to turn back on itself. And then the actual graphene is going to go on this belt over here. No, actually, no, it's not. It's going to go on this belt over here and then go all the way back and back into this box. Now, in order to make graphene, we also need acid, and the acid is, of course, being made here and put into that box. But then we are looping that back over here into this box, and then again bringing it over on this belt. And then down here, and we have the acid that we need in order to make the graphene. Using a similar logic, I added in the organic crystals, which need 3 resources, as you know. So it's a nice layout with 4 belts in between each set of chemical plants. And repeating that same pattern down here, we have once again 4 belts, with 2 belts incoming with distributors with the titanium and graphene, and then that's going to make this carbon nanotube. Now, the output belt is in this case actually on the inside, just because I wanted to have the 4-4-4 type of layouts in terms of belts, because that looks very straight and organized. We're almost ready to start producing the first 4 types of science, but in order to do that, we're going to need the diamonds as well as the crystal silicon, so I added in another row of smelters. Now, this keeps everything nice and compact, because we only need 7 diamond smelters and 5 of these crystal silicon smelters, so all in all, it's starting to look really organized and really compact. Now, obviously, this is not going to produce anything unless we add sorters and power and actual supply units to, well, get something from outer space, as well as move things in between these actual storage depots. So I added all of those in. And there's a couple of things I want to note. So first of all, I kind of forgot that stacking up these spray painters does work, but you actually need to raise the belts a little higher than what I had done initially. So nothing major in terms of a revamp here. I just needed to make sure I actually had the height for the belts correct, and that means kind of reorganizing the storage depots a little bit, but all in all, it's still very straightforward, and you can see how I did that in the screen right here. The second thing in terms of belts is that, of course, we have 2 levels of proliferators. So we actually need to split those off, and you can use a splitter to do exactly that in a way that I think looks pretty neat, because we still have the 2 belts of proliferators running below each other. Now, if you want to know how you actually make one of these, this is just a normal splitter, but if you press tab, you get certain variations of the splitter depending on what you might want to do. So you have the normal cross section, you have the one that actually splits the belt in 2 different levels, and the second one does the same thing, but it's kind of a combination of these 2, so it still splits it in a different level, but at different heights as well. When it comes to setting up these logistics distributors in large numbers, make sure you set the auto replenishment enabled, because if you don't, every time you will build a blueprint, you'll actually have to manually add these things, and you really do not want to do that every single time, because there's like, I don't know how many, like 30 in this build alone, so doing that manual is a pain. And also make sure, of course, that you have the provide or request setting put up correctly, because otherwise this won't actually work. In terms of these ILS towers, the nice thing is we have exactly 10 inputs that we need for this build. So we have a lot of raw resources over here, and then we have another set of raw resources over here, including hydrogen and oil. And I'll get to that in a moment, but we also are requesting proliferators right here. And right now it's not set to request anything, but of course you want to make sure you change that when you build it yourself, or you can just use my blueprint and it will already be set up. Again, the auto replenishment is just really convenient, just so you don't actually forget to put in your vessels. Another thing that I don't actually think I mentioned in this series so far is that you can actually pick up things from your ILSs from anywhere in the world. So you don't actually need to be anywhere near it. As you can see, I'm on the other side of the planet. But if you go to the planet overview by pressing M, you can just click an ILS and pick up whatever you need from that. So yes, you can, of course, have your logistic bots bring it to you. But if you're out of range of those, or you just need a huge amount, like belts in the example I just showed you, then it's a simple click and you have all the belts you need. Now, getting back to this ILS where we were requesting both the oil and the hydrogen, that is because I consider those to be raw resources. Oil is literally only created from the raw oil, of course, so you need to refine it anyway. That holds for several other items as well, but the byproduct is, of course, hydrogen that we don't necessarily need in the build where we're creating that, and just having to funnel that off is really annoying. So what I always do with oil, and it's the only item that actually applies to, is I create that elsewhere wherever I have oil on the planet, and then ship it off to wherever it needs to go, and then the hydrogen can go wherever that needs to go. Now, in this case, we have hydrogen on this planet, so what we're going to do is actually revisit an old favorite, which is this tiny little oil setup that we can simply copy paste 10 times to get a more larger version of this that will actually supply us with a full belt of refined oil as well as half a belt of hydrogen. Now, of course, in this version of the build, we want some drones in there, especially since we are actually producing oil on this planet. We want to upgrade everything to Mark III belts and sorters, but I assume you know how to do that by now. Don't forget to add in another ILS at the end, because of course that is where we want our oil and hydrogen to go, and we want to be able to export it off planet. I added in these buffer boxes just because, but you don't really need them, so if you prefer not to do that, by all means just leave those out. And of course, all the production in the world isn't going to help us produce any science if we don't have any matrix labs. Now, I'm actually going to reserve this area in between for the actual matrix labs, for the simple reason that this build you can duplicate around the equator, and then in the line above that you can duplicate the associated matrix lab layout, and that will help you produce this build over and over once you're ready to scale it up. And the layout for the matrix labs is going to be very straightforward. You need 5 blue, 10 red, 13 yellow, and 16 purple in whatever stacking order you want to do it in, but I kind of like this kind of multiplying stacks over here. Now, I recommend that you place the outgoing belts far to the right, because the green one is going to come in here as well, and it's slightly larger, and you also want to proliferate both the inputs and the outputs, and I apparently forgot the output, so let me go and fix that. And with the second belt of proliferation fixed, and having moved everything a little bit to the right, because I kind of want to align these boxes with each other, and I think it looks pretty neat. Now has the time come to actually turn everything on and find out where I messed up. Like, you know, powering the other half of your facility because you play with the blinking lights turned off in order to keep your viewers sane. And, you know, actually connecting everything to a power grid that's able to sustain it. Oh well, that's what all those solar panels we had in production were for. Also, it helps that the places where you're actually collecting the coal have that set to local supply if they're on the same planet. And apparently I'm not getting stone nor titanium ore because I don't actually have an ILS set up to supply those things. And it helps if you actually have a logistics distributor on top of all your storage units. Didn't I just tell you guys to make sure you set the settings on your logistics distributors correctly? And, you know, labeling things correctly so you actually put your logistic distributors to pick up the correct thing also helps. And even if you do label correctly, making sure your storage box is actually connected to the correct belts is also very useful. Same goes for the actual assemblers. And there we go, all 4 types of science in production. Now, the reason I'm showing you all of these little silly mistakes is just to show you that everyone makes those. At least I do in pretty much every single build that I make. I'll always forget sorters, settings, some belt will be wrong or whatever. So if you make your own build and you make some mistakes, don't be too hard on yourself. I mean, it's a complicated game, and part of the fun is actually trying to debug where things are going wrong. Now, in order to actually put this science to use, we're going to need a proper science facility. And for those of you who have actually followed my earlier series, you probably know what is coming now. We are going to be building a science polar hub because it's one of the coolest things you can do in the game. Now, you can make these as small or as large as you want. It doesn't really matter because you can stack these facilities, and even a small circle can add up to a lot of matrix labs. make it as big as or small as you want. I do recommend that you leave some space in between the matrix slabs because that allows you to get the belts through, and it also makes it easier to upgrade this once we get to white science. But then again, at that point you might as well just make yourself a new polar hub because these are not the most complicated to make. Step 1, make a circle of matrix slabs. Make yourself some circles of belts. Add in some power poles to make sure everything is actually in reach. This distance is actually pretty large, so you'll need to place the power poles on both sides of the matrix slabs, unless you want to put them in between, but then we'll get in the way later. Now, in order to save yourself some work, delete all the matrix slabs and set up one single one with all the sorters as well as the correct recipe. Just set it to research, and then use that one as a template to build all the other ones. And then just stack up the matrix slabs as high as you want, but actually I would recommend keeping it fairly low for now, just because it looks a lot cooler if you do. Now you're going to need to supply the actual science to these belts, and there's a couple of different ways in which you can do that. I chose to stick with the theme with the distributors because it's not a high throughput thing at all. And actually I doubled this on the other side just to make sure it's future proof basically. This will go a very long way in having enough throughput to supply all the signs to the belts, and we can stack this up further, etc, etc. But what you can also do is put an ILS in the middle and have outgoing belts like with a star-like shape or whatever. The problem with that specific type of build that I have used in the previous playthroughs as well is that you need some way to actually connect those outgoing belts to these belts, and that gets well, it's not the biggest problem in the world, but it gets a little bit messy because these belts are right next to each other, and you also need to bring the outer belts from the middle all the way to the outside. It's not the biggest thing in the world. I do like the very clean complete circle solution that we have going with the distributors now, so that is what I'm going to stick to. And then let the light show begin. Now, I really like having the belts move in opposite directions because, as you can see, it looks really cool. At this point, what you want to start researching is everything that you need in order to unlock green signs, because of course we are missing one color in here, but we actually need purple signs in order to research the stuff for the green signs. So make sure you start doing that right now. And we're going to expand our production facilities with the required materials in order to make that green science, starting off with 4 of these assemblers making particle containers, 9 assemblers making titanium glass, 13 assemblers making planar filters. Yes, this is a very annoying slow recipe. And I actually started the inputs from the other side in order to be able to fill in these gaps that we had all over the place. This is the longest stretch of assemblers that we're going to need, so this is going to fit nicely in with the particle containers. In order to make those planar filters, we're actually going to need Casimir crystals as well, and that is where these 4 assemblers come in. Now, I made sure to align the inputs with the inputs for the planar filter, so I can once again make a straight line of proliferators here in a moment. And according to the exact same principle, we also have 4 assemblers making quantum chips. Now, this is a pretty straightforward recipe, and the awesome thing is that we actually now have one of the 2 things we're going to need for green science. But of course, we also need the other half, so let's keep working on that. The other thing being gravity lenses, which again we need 4 assemblers for. And in order to make those, we're actually going to need this strange matter, which we have not created just yet. But I figured we might as well just finish off the assemblers first. Now, these gravity lenses can also be used to make warpers, but you should never, ever do that unless you're desperate, because it's way more efficient to make warpers directly from green signs. So just pointing that out. Now, in order to make strange matter, we actually need a particle collider, which we don't currently have yet. So you should probably have unlocked that along the way right now, because you have the yellow signs up and running. You actually only need yellow signs for the particle colliders. You have most of the materials you need to make these on this planet already. If you don't have that for whatever reason, just pop back to your mole planet and get them there. You only need 10 of these, so just handcraft them. Don't worry about optimizing or mass producing these just yet. You don't really need that many particle colliders throughout the entire game anyway. But you're going to need 10 right now, so make sure you get those. And once you have the particle colliders, you can make a very nice looking layout like this in order to make 2 items. We're going to need to make some deuterium, as you can see over here. It's a very straightforward recipe. There's a different way to make those as well using fractionators, but it's a messy process. It's actually a pretty decent process, don't get me wrong. It's a pretty valid way to make deuterium. But this just makes it a lot easier to plan out and to ensure we get exactly how much we need. So I just prefer doing it like this. Now the second item that we're going to be making is the strange matter itself. It's a bit of a weird recipe in my opinion. It's very straightforward. You have 3 inputs and 1 output, so I like putting the output belts on the side and then just taking them around like this. And positioning them like this, make sure you can keep the build really compact. If you flip them over and you want to do it like that, they become really... Yeah, I don't know. I just don't like putting them in the horizontal position. You might be wondering why there's 3 distributors here. That's because these particle colliders actually gobble up a lot of hydrogen. So this is just to make sure we have enough of that coming in. And of course, we need to make sure we proliferate everything. Now, if we look at the build in total, I think it is a very nice looking build. And remember, this is actually from raw resources, with the exception of the refined oil that we're making right over there. And the nice thing about using logistic bots for this is that it's really easy to keep it nice and clean. It's also really easy later on to use rare recipes and make sure we use the resources we get from that wherever we need it, including in this build. So all in all, I think this is a very elegant way to get your science going. Speaking of science, of course, we also need some matrix slabs. We need 20 of them to be exact. You can build them in whatever way you like. I actually prefer to kind of go with the same layout that we had going before, and make sure you put them into a box and proliferate them. Now that should automatically mean your build over here is going to start picking them up. If, of course, unlike me, you set the nice filters on the distributors. There we go. Let's make sure this picks them up. And as you can see, we are already producing them in a rather large quantities. Now with this build, you can actually clear out the entire technology tree with the exception of white science, as well as of course all the upgrades that you have for your bots, your research speed, your vein utilization, etc, etc, again, unless it requires white science. Essentially, you kind of already won the game, even though we're far from done. However, there is one more thing you need to do at this point, which is making a very simple build like this, where we're requesting some green science and we're turning that green science into warpers. Now remember, you get 8 warpers per green science, plus proliferation is actually 10 warpers per green science. It's a really efficient recipe. You just want to make sure you're not putting all your green science into that, because of course you also need to actually research some stuff. For that reason, make sure you set the limit on your interstellar logistics station to a very low amount, just to make sure these are not being overproduced in thousands of them. It's pretty easy to do so, but you really do not need that many warpers at this point in time. Which brings us to the end of this episode, and I hope you really enjoyed it. It's a very fun thing to do, actually, building one build that makes all the different types of science. It's also really easy to scale things up later on with that. And speaking of scaling up, now we have unlocked the entire technology tree. We have a lot of that to do. So make sure you join me in the next episode. For now, if you're still here, you're awesome, and I hope to catch you in the next one.